Hello, welcome to Siege Budget Brews. I'm Tim, and tonight I am covering tips for improving your mana bases. But before we get started, please check out our Discord and our Patreon. Links are in the description below. And if you like our content, please hit that like, share, and subscribe. It really helps out a lot. Okay, so tips for improving mana bases, especially like if you're on a budget. Kind of one of the first things I like to, when I talk about mana bases with people, I like to discuss talking holistically about your mana base, and this includes your ramp. So like a couple of good examples of that is like making sure you have a forest count that can support cards like Utopia Sprawl and Arbor Elf, or that you have an artifact count that is adequate to support cards like Glimmer Void or Spire of Industry. This is kind of I'll touch on it a little bit more later, but thinking holistically is one of the reasons why you kind of tend to see cards like City of Brass and Mana Confluence in a lot of lists, because we start at 40 life. Taking 1 mana to be able to cast, any spell in your deck and help you make those double colored pips is kind of a big deal. The next thing, especially, now this one more applies to people trying to play on a budget than people who play budgetless, is do not play any lands or minimize lands that kind of come into play tapped unconditionally. There's some small caveats with this, especially like when you really start going down to like really ultra budget lists. You can't like again, like with the artifact count and the forest count as examples. Like sometimes there's some really cheap, like common dual lands that come into play tapped, but they'll help you support your stuff like Arbor Elf or Utopia Sprawl. There's even some common based artifact lands that are duals that you can use to kind of help support things like Spire of Industry or Metalcraft, like if you need things like that. But even if you are playing those, I only do that in like really, really, really low budgeted decks. Pretty much anything on the website won't be playing these, even on a Tiny Pack mana base. And then, secondly, I really only play them if I have to. And I limit them to like no more than 3. And again, like that's in like really, really, really low budget decks. Really not a huge fan of them personally. And kind of like the next thing to kind of touch on is reducing the color pip intensity wherever possible. Like we'll take like precons for example, right? I know that probably most people who are watching this channel aren't playing with precons too often, but if you ever looked up a deck list for one, they're chocked full of cards that are like double pip, triple pip, and then you got all of these 3-mana rocks, and you got all of these ETB tapped lands, and it's like you can't cast this 6-drop for 3 white mana till like turn 8, and by then, the game's basically over in most instances. What you want to do, one of the ways that makes you able to kind of chain multiple spells together, or be able to cap and things like be able to make a win attempt and protect it, is to lessen the amount of colored pips that are required for you in your deck. So like for example, that a good example of these are like, that's why you see delay a lot more common than like counterspell or even mana drain, because that double blue is pretty cost prohibitive, whereas a blue and a colorless is a lot easier to cast. That's also why you see things like Dam being less utilized versus like Toxic Deluge, because again, it's 1 black, 2 colorless versus the black or the white and 2. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're looking at like trying to execute casting these spells and then protecting them early game, having to create that extra color pip is going to generally be where you kind of get choked on mana, especially in the early game. Having like black, white, 2 colorless, and then a blue to protect your board wipe is like on turn 3 is pretty like, that's pretty intense. Or even having like double blue and then another spell that you need to cast, and then being able to generate that 2 blue to protect it, again, is very, very cost prohibitive. So wherever possible, you want to reduce that pip intensity of your decks, right? And then kind of like the next thing after the pip intensity is really utilizing the tools that you have available to help you better be able to craft a mana base. So for example, one of the biggest ones is I don't even know exactly what it's called in Moxfield, but it's this thing right here where these top numbers, like the 13, the 31, the 19, and the 19 and the 24, those are the color requirements for your deck. So in this instance, 13% of this deck is white, 31% is blue, 19% is black, 19% is red, and 24% is colorless. All right. And then down below here, this lower number is the percentage that your deck can produce from lands. So 36% of my deck can make, of my lands can make white, 50% can make blue, 43% can make black, 39% can make red, and then 18% can generate colorless. And obviously outside of like trying to cast like very specific like Rise of Eldrazi spells, colorless mana is just universal, and cards like Sol Ring make specifically colorless mana, but then you can just use any color mana as generic mana, as long as it doesn't specifically have this colorless mana symbol in its casting cost. That's like what the number with the circles for. It means you can just use anything for it. But with this, what you want to do is you really want to, as much as possible, is really try to keep this number as close to double this upper number. So as you can tell, like when it comes to my blue mana production in this deck, it's a little insufficient, so I might find myself early game having a hard time casting my spells with blue in them, or casting other spells and then having blue to kind of follow up with it. But when you look at like my red, I am producing more than double, because that would be 38% would be double. I'm over in black. I'm way over in white. In fact, I couldn't reduce the right white color requirements anymore without it affecting the other colors anyway. Technically, I should probably have at least 2 more blue producing lands of some sort. But all of my lands are essentially, for the most part, going to be lands that produce blue and then another color. So I can't really kind of shore it up too much. But again, like with this deck, I don't actually have a difficult time, because a lot of it is I'm fixing from mana rocks as well. So I can pump a lot of that colorless mana into a rock, and a lot of my rocks make blue to kind of help further shore up that mana requirement. Now this is from a budgetless deck, so obviously I can basically play perfect mana. I pulled up an example of a 5-color $500 deck, and you see I still have the same, actually I have a better spread. And this is kind of a little bit of a trick, because in the budgetless deck I had fetch lands, which don't count as color producing lands, so they kind of skew the numbers, whereas this one has a lot less fetch lands, obviously because of the budget. So it makes, since all of the lands produce raw mana for the most part, it appears that these numbers are a lot higher, whereas the mana is definitely better in the budgetless build, because I have the like actual dual lands and actual fetches. Whereas here I have a lot of shock lands. I do have some fetches, but then I also have like a lot of rainbow lands and a lot of pain lands and things like that as well. But again, you just kind of really want this number down here, which is like 52, to be almost double, or as close as you can to double of the requirement. So what that does is that kind of just makes it easier for you to be able to cast like 2 spells with green, or green, white, blue, black on the same turn. Like, and we're essentially like using turn 3 as our metric to be able to like do double pip and something else, or do like your like a full spread of like casting all 4 of your colors or all 5 of your colors in any combination you need. In fact, this kind of brings me to my next point, which is, I touched on it a little bit earlier, but the importance of playing those rainbow lands. So on my mana base template, which is linked on the website, which will also be linked in the description below, I have a specific section for rainbow lands. There's 11 of them listed. Not all of them are created equal. These are the ones that I use predominantly, and then the rest of them are to kind of fill it in as I need. They're not in necessarily any particular order, but I will kind of discuss probably my 3 or 4 best ones. Obviously Command Tower, because it'll make whatever color your commander identity is. Thus, if your deck is 5 colors, it will make 5 colors: 4, 3, 2, and 1. Probably don't need command tower in a 1 color deck, but there's sometimes like special corner cases. City of Brass, 1 damage when you have 40 life is very, very nominal. And being able to do things like cast blue, 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 black, white, blue, all on turn 2, turn 3 is double black. Like being able to do double black and then a blue for counter magic or a red or something is very, very important. And these lands help make that possible. Just below City of Brass is Mana Confluence. Technically, Mana Confluence is slightly superior to City of Brass in most cases, because City of Brass will deal damage every time it becomes tapped, whereas Mana Confluence is specifically when it makes mana. The downside is that if you play against a lot of hate bears and you run across like Yusharn, it shuts off Mana Confluence, but doesn't shut off City of Brass, which is actually a pretty common hate piece. And then beyond that, Exotic Orchard is one I play quite a bit. Forbidden Orchard is one I play a lot. I always find one guy that, given a 1/1 Spiritomb, really isn't gonna make or break the deck too much. Even in Tymna decks, sometimes in Tymna decks, this will probably be one of the last rainbow lands I add. Definitely won't be the first. Once I get to like the 4th or 5th land, this definitely starts becoming one that I'm including. And then follow kind of right behind Forbidden Orchard is Gemstone Mines. I generally only play Gemstone Mine in fast combo decks. Pretty much decks that I don't really need to activate lands more than 2 or 3 times anyway to execute a win, because I just play this like my 2nd or 3rd land, and then I get 2 or 3 activations out of it. And then another one that I actually play that's really kind of a personal favorite of mine is Spire of Industry. I tend to play a lot of rock heavy decks. So by rock heavy, I mean in like 15 plus artifacts, because you really need enough artifacts to support this card, so that way it's producing mana on turn 1. I definitely would not play this in a deck running like less than 12 to 15, probably more like 15. And then all the way up to like, I mean, pretty much anything over 15, you're definitely essentially good, because you're aggressively mulliganing for those rocks as well, because that's most of your ramp. Whereas, like, once you start getting below 12, you'll start having problems where it'll be a couple of turns before it gets online, and that's kind of an issue. Whereas, like, if you're playing a deck that's running, say, like Mox Opal, even though that card requires 3 artifacts for Metalcraft to be online, you really don't need that card till you're post Naws, and then you have a bunch of artifacts in your hand anyway, and then you can use those to turn it online. Whereas this, you're trying to kind of use it over multiple turns. But I definitely play City of Brass, Mana Confluence, and Command Tower. Exotic Orchard, Forbidden Orchard, and Spire kind of tend to be the next 3 that I'm looking at most of the time. And another one I actually do play kind of regularly is Thran-Kori. Thran-Kori, I have to have a little bit of a caveat with it. That caveat is that essentially you really want about 20 plus. You want about 20 creatures or so to really, really be able to leverage this. Usually my magic number is 22 plus. If I'm running 22 or more creatures in my deck, and especially if I'm on like a dwarf-based ramp package, I'd feel pretty safe running this in like above a 3 color. I'd say 4 or 5 color. Like I play this in a lot of Najeela builds, honestly. Especially budget Najeela builds, that like the non-Turbo Naws ones, because I generally tend to be on a lot more creatures. I would hesitate to run it in like the NBC, like the Najeela Turbo Naws builds, but you know, again, it's worth considering. And then like for some budget options, just to kind of throw them out here, like this is like $4. It just requires that you have an artifact. Again, I would at least want a similar rock count that I would want for Spire, because what you don't want is that 1 rock to get blown up early and then you to lose your only land. So do kind of watch out for that. I generally don't play this in anything over like the bottom tier of like what I would put on the website, which is $500. Another one that I've been kind of testing, and it's been pretty good. You got to watch it a little bit with, so it only makes mana for the colors of permanents, like legendary permanents that you have. Like take Najila, for example. While her color identity is 5, she's, is Wooburg, she's actually only a red creature. So thus Plaza of Heroes would only make red. Whereas if you had like Tymna, it would make black or white. So do kind of be, conscientious of that. But the ability to cast those commanders and then to make whatever color are in your commanders, especially for like a $6 card, it's pretty nice. And then just to kind of like wrap up, just to kind of closing, kind of put a little bow in this, is like, think of your mana base holistically, for sure. And include your ramp package as part of that holistic view. Because what you don't want is, a lot of players kind of tend to think about casting their spells, like think about this part of their deck last, and then think about all the cool stuff they're putting in it. Really, 1/3 of your cards are going to be sources of mana. 1/3 to a half, depending on what kind of deck you're playing. So don't chintz out on it. Like, you really, if you're building a budget deck, like 1/3 of your budget should at least almost 1/3 to like 40% of your deck budget should be your mana production. Like, just keep that in mind. So thanks again for joining me. I hope you found this helpful. I will link the mana base template. It's on the website. I will also link this directly in the description. So everybody, have a good night. Bye.